Welcome to our channel. In this video, we'll explore the electrifying highs of a young phenom who seemed destined for superstardom, and the sobering lows that followed when off-ice temptations and scandals caught up with him. Brace yourself for a compelling look at how one of the brightest rising stars in hockey history found himself torn between talent and turmoil, and discover how his story still resonates today. Flying back to his hometown in British Columbia during the summer of 1977, a distraught Don Murdoch shut himself in the airplane bathroom, buried his face in his hands, and let the tears fall. Just 6 months earlier, he had been the talk of the National Hockey League, an electrifying rookie for the New York Rangers who had already made an appearance in the NHL All-Star Game. At 20 years old, he possessed a combination of talent, fame, and wealth that most aspiring athletes only dream of. Yet in that tiny airplane lavatory, he found himself consumed by guilt and shame, aware that his own rash decisions had led him to a moment of profound regret. He felt his once promising future slipping through his fingers. He had no idea that his troubles were only beginning. There would be criminal charges, public scorn, and a crushing stigma that threatened to derail everything he had worked for as a young hockey phenom. Born in Cranbrook, British Columbia, Don Murdoch made waves in junior hockey with the Medicine Hat Tigers, teaming up with Morris Lukovic and Greg Carroll to form one of the most potent lines the Western Canada Hockey League, WCHL, had ever seen. Between 1974 and 1976, Murdoch was an offensive wrecking ball, putting up 2 remarkable seasons of over 80 goals each. Scouts and general managers across the NHL were mesmerized by his sniper's touch and his fearless drive to the net. Ultimately, the New York Rangers selected him 6th overall in the 1976 NHL draft, eager to find a new face for their offense after they had parted ways with Rick Middleton. Rangers brass touted Murdoch as a can't-miss replacement for their aging legend, Rod Gilbert, and they believed they had scored big by bringing in the next great goal-scoring wizard. Murdoch did not disappoint. From the moment he stepped onto NHL ice, he seemed unstoppable. In his first 3 big league games, he racked up 8 goals, including an astonishing 5-goal performance in a single night. He was on a record-smashing pace, producing 14 goals in his first 14 games, then 17 in his first 20, and finally 25 in his first 32 contests. The entire league took notice. John Ferguson, then the Rangers' general manager, compared Murdoch's raw flair to that of Guy Lafleur, one of hockey's all-time greats. As the season barreled on, Murdoch earned the honor of appearing in the NHL All-Star Game, an especially sweet moment because that year's event was hosted in Vancouver, close to his old stomping grounds. The world was Murdoch's oyster, and it truly felt like a storybook beginning to a career written in bright Broadway lights. But what no one knew was that this unstoppable rookie's life away from the rink was moving at an equally fast pace, and not necessarily for the better. The dreamlike ascent began to wobble when, on Valentine's Day 1977, Murdoch tore a tendon in his ankle during practice. The once unstoppable flow of goals was abruptly halted, as the injury sidelined him for much of the remaining season. He would need multiple surgeries to fix the damage. Instead of continuing his assault on the record books, he ended his rookie campaign with 32 goals in 59 games. That was still an impressive total, but it left him just 1 goal shy of Willie Plett, who ultimately captured the Calder Trophy as the league's top rookie. The abrupt setback should have been a mere bump in the road for such a prolific scorer, but it turned out to be more like the first sign of trouble, a chink in the armor of a young man who had never truly struggled. During those weeks off the ice, Murdoch became immersed in the glitter and glam of New York City's nightlife. He was recognized everywhere he went. After all, he was the Rangers' sizzling young star, the cool new kid in town who generated headlines. If there was a line to get into a famed disco or celebrity haunt, he never had to wait. If there were drinks to be had, someone else was always buying. In the atmosphere of 1970s New York, an era drenched in disco, celebrity sightings, and the fashionable excesses of places like Studio 54, it was almost alarmingly easy for a small-town kid to lose himself. Murdoch found no shortage of temptations in the city that never sleeps. First came the free drinks and the non-stop party invitations. But soon he was offered more than liquor, and he discovered an even more dangerous path. He found himself in the company of friends who introduced him to drugs. For a while, life felt like a roller coaster at its peak, a mixture of adulation from fans, boisterous nights in exclusive clubs, endless praise from local media, and a sense that all of New York's glitz was open to him whenever he wanted. Few people told him no, and at 20, he rarely told himself no, either. He gave little thought to the long-term consequences of such a high-octane lifestyle. He was adored by some of the city's top socialites, partied with the likes of Sylvester Stallone and Mick Jagger, and occasionally found himself dancing at iconic venues next to Margaret Trudeau. It was exhilarating to be young, rich, and famous in the late 1970s in New York, but every party has its dawn, and for Murdoch, that early morning came with startling intensity in August of 1977. On August 12, 1977, customs officers at Toronto International Airport rummaged through Don Murdoch's tote bag and found 4.8 grams of cocaine, a razor blade, and a rolled-up dollar bill. In an instant, the house of cards he had built came tumbling down around him. This was not just a minor infraction or a slap on the wrist. It was a criminal act in a very public setting. Headlines blared across Canada and the United States, dragging Murdoch's name through harsh scrutiny. That flight home in tears made more sense than ever. He was staring at serious criminal charges, an avalanche of negative press, and the possibility that his unstoppable rise in professional hockey might be snuffed out just as quickly as it began. Because the court proceedings were delayed for more than a year, Murdoch played the entire 1977-78 season under a cloud of uncertainty, enduring insults from hostile crowds around the league every time he touched the puck. Fans shouted derogatory names, accused him of being a junkie, and seemed determined to intensify his misery. On the ice, his numbers slipped. From a blistering start in his rookie season to a more subdued 27 goals and 55 points in 66 games in 1977-78, he showed flashes of brilliance but lacked the consistent dominance he had previously displayed. Nagging injuries, coupled with the psychological strain of facing criminal charges and the onslaught of public opinion, took their toll. Despite those struggles, his partying lifestyle did not subside. Lonely nights and the burden of condemnation only magnified his vices. He himself admitted years later that he was still going out, chasing a good time, and lacking the discipline required to harness his potential. Those who played beside him during that turbulent period recall a prodigious talent bogged down by poor habits. Teammate Phil Esposito later wrote that at first, he assumed Don was primarily dealing with a drinking problem. He would smell of alcohol on the ice and appear hungover at practices. But the real gravity of Murdoch's predicament would become even clearer as time went on. He was battling more than alcohol. He was simultaneously entangled in a struggle with drugs and with his own inability to rein in his impulses. Even so, in a testament to his raw skill, Murdoch still found moments to shine. In one playoff overtime game against the Buffalo Sabres, he buried a crucial winner that sent Ranger fans into ecstatic celebration. It was a reminder that beneath the chaos of his personal life, he remained a special player capable of performing clutch heroics. Eventually, in July of 1978, his legal case finally concluded. Murdoch received a suspended sentence and a modest $400 fine for the cocaine possession. In some ways, that legal penalty was surprisingly lenient. He avoided jail time, and the overall punishment from the court seemed to leave him room to keep playing. However, the biggest blow came from NHL president John Ziegler, who sought to make a conspicuous example of Murdoch as the league's first major public drug incident. Ziegler threw the book at him, handing down a one-year suspension. It was a dramatic response, one that signaled the NHL's intention to punish severely rather than focus on rehabilitation. The league had few precedents for handling these matters, and many believed that this harsh stance might have been influenced by fears that the drug culture was creeping into the sport. Murdoch, caught so publicly, became the scapegoat for a bigger problem the league was determined to stifle. While the league gave him no sympathy, Murdoch surprisingly found a supporter in Sonny Werblin, the Rangers' owner at the time. Werblin chose to stand behind the embattled forward, signing him to a lucrative 3-year contract even while he was sidelined by the suspension. That financial gesture was an extraordinary show of faith, perhaps an understanding that Murdoch, despite his glaring mistakes, still possessed that sniper's magic. Nevertheless, there was no escaping the harsh reality. Murdoch would spend the early part of the 1978-79 season as a spectator. It was a strange period, watching from the outside as his teammates battled on the ice. The shame he felt weighed heavily, and many fans assumed his best days might already be behind him. But once Ziegler lifted the suspension after 40 games, Murdoch was desperate to prove that the old Don was back. He returned to the Rangers lineup in dramatic fashion, scoring a hat trick in just his second game. It was an explosive statement to those who had doubted whether he still had the scoring knack. Soon, he found himself on the Mafia line, flanking Phil Esposito alongside Don Maloney. The trio provided a revitalizing spark for a team that eventually went on a thrilling run to the 1979 Stanley Cup Final. Murdoch's highlight reel goals and crisp puck handling reminded people why he had been such a prized prospect. For a fleeting moment, it felt like the redemption arc was complete. Yet beneath that optimism lurked a growing list of injuries, surgically repaired ankles, shoulder and back issues, that would become increasingly difficult to overcome. Meanwhile, old habits die hard, and Murdoch's off-ice discipline never fully stabilized. By 1980, the Rangers coaching staff, under Fred Shuro, shifted Murdoch's role, reducing his minutes and sometimes making him a healthy scratch. Frustrated by the dwindling opportunities, he asked for a trade. In March of 1980, the Rangers obliged and sent him to the Edmonton Oilers in exchange for Cam Connor. This could have been another chance at a fresh start. In fact, it looked like a dream scenario. The Oilers were emerging as a powerhouse, and their young center Wayne Gretzky was already rewriting record books. Murdoch initially slotted in on Gretzky's wing and tallied a respectable 7 goals in 13 combined regular season and postseason games. For a brief shining interval, it seemed as though Don Murdoch might resurrect himself as a key piece of a young, offensively gifted Oilers roster. However, 1980 Oilers training camp quickly revealed another twist of fate. A relatively unknown Finnish rookie by the name of Jari Kurri impressed head coach and general manager Glenn Sather so thoroughly that Kurri eventually slid in beside Gretzky, forming one of the most potent duos in NHL history. That left Murdoch drifting down the depth chart. Rumors circulated that Oilers management worried he might be a bad influence on his younger cousin, Mark Messier, who had also joined the team and was beginning to find his own stardom. Before long, the Oilers placed Murdoch on waivers. In a testament to how far he had fallen, not a single NHL team claimed him. At the tender age of 25, the one-time surefire superstar found himself banished to the Central Hockey League's Wichita Wind, an unglamorous minor league destination for a player with once infinite promise. A slump into the minors is often a crossroads. Some players use it as motivation to climb back, while others sink further into despair. For Murdoch, that first stint in Wichita in 1980 was brutal. He was miserable, unaccustomed to the grueling bus rides, smaller crowds, and significantly diminished spotlight. Attendance in Wichita hovered around a dismal 1,500 fans a night, and the team's lackluster record only darkened his mood. He missed multiple practices, fueling speculation that his old demons were not behind him. But a turning point came when he left the club, took time to reflect, and decided he still had a passion for the game. With renewed determination, he returned to the Wind, suddenly playing like the unstoppable force of his youth. He racked up a jaw-dropping 17 goals in 18 playoff games, propelling Wichita all the way to the CHL's Adams Cup Finals. In recognition of his extraordinary performance, the league named him playoff MVP. This dramatic turnaround briefly revived the interest of several NHL general managers. The Minnesota North Stars acquired Murdoch's rights, but before he could don their sweater, they flipped him to the Detroit Red Wings along with Greg Smith in an intricate deal involving draft picks in 1982. In a twist of irony, the North Stars used one of those draft picks to secure Brian Bellows, who went on to have a stellar NHL career. Meanwhile, Detroit took a chance on Murdoch, hoping he might rediscover the scoring brilliance that had once enthralled the league. Sadly, it was not to be. Murdoch managed just 9 goals in 49 games for the Red Wings, showing moments of skill but never finding the consistency that had once defined him. Eventually, Detroit shipped him to their all-affiliate, the Adirondack Red Wings, and that effectively sealed the fate of his big league career. While he toiled in the minors, Murdoch's name continued to appear in media coverage, most notably in a book titled Thin Ice, by Larry "Ratso" Sloman. Sloman had followed the Rangers for the 1979-80 season and documented every lurid detail of Murdoch's nightlife. Those recollections were graphic, outlining in no uncertain terms the boozy, drug-laced, and womanizing escapades that had once defined Murdoch's after hours in New York. Excerpts from Sloman's account even appeared in a February 1982 issue of an adult magazine, further cementing Murdoch's notoriety. He would later be described by Phil Esposito as a maniac when it came to women. It seemed that as soon as he tried to push past his old mistakes, new reminders of them surfaced in the press, intensifying the sense that he was trapped in a never-ending cycle of sensational headlines. Despite wanting nothing more than a final shot at an NHL roster spot, Murdoch's body and skills continued to deteriorate. After years of living hard, countless late nights, questionable diets, and the general physical toll of hockey, it became obvious that he had lost that explosive edge. His wrist shots weren't as quick, and his skating no longer had the same pop. The final years of his pro career dragged on in some of hockey's lower minors: Montana, Muskegon, Indianapolis, and Toledo. For a fleeting time, he held out hope that strong performances could reignite an NHL team's interest, but that call never came. In 1986, at 29, he stepped away from the ice altogether, his career ending in a way that would have seemed unthinkable a decade earlier. The once heralded wonderkid had become a cautionary tale. Returning to Cranbrook, he took a job with his brother Bob, another former NHL player, loading beer trucks. The contrast was striking. A few years earlier, Don Murdoch had been dancing under the disco ball at Studio 54, earning an all-star selection in a building filled with adoring fans, and now he was humbly going about day-to-day labor. Yet, he displayed a certain resilience, refusing to dwell forever on what might have been. Gradually, he reconnected with hockey in a different way. In the early 1990s, he joined Phil Esposito's Tampa Bay Lightning as a scout, putting his keen eye for talent to good use. His ability to identify promising prospects allowed him to ascend within Tampa Bay's organization, eventually becoming director of player personnel. He also spent time coaching in the ECHL with the Louisiana Ice Gators, leading them to the finals. Those who worked with him noticed how enthusiastic he was about guiding young players. He would speak candidly about his own mistakes, warning them how a string of bad decisions could abruptly end a promising career. In effect, he repurposed his painful experiences, channeling them into mentorship. By 2001, Murdoch officially brought to a close his longer-than-you'd-expect professional involvement in the game, retiring from full-time work. He settled back into Cranbrook, devoting himself to family life, going golfing, and co-running a successful hockey school for local youths who dreamed of following a straighter path to the NHL. Looking back from the vantage point of someone who saw the heights of NHL superstardom and the depths of personal ruin, Murdoch often expressed a lingering regret. He would say that not a single day passed without him thinking about how he wished he could do it over again. He spoke openly about his struggle to handle fame in New York City, lamenting that some guys can handle it, and some guys can't. And, in his view, he simply wasn't ready for the big stage. Yet, in the face of all that sorrow and the frustration of having left behind so much unfulfilled promise, Don Murdoch gradually discovered a sense of purpose in making sure that the next generation did not repeat his mistakes. He believed in turning negatives into positives, in forging something constructive out of experiences that nearly destroyed him. It is no exaggeration to say that Don Murdoch's rise and fall played out like a real-life parable, a story about youthful genius, unchecked indulgence, and the consequences of fame that arrives too quickly. The Rangers faithful who cheered his lightning bolt goals in 1976-77 remain wistful about what might have been had his path run free of those self-inflicted detours. Would he have become a perennial all-star? A scoring champion? One of the game's greatest snipers of his era? There was no doubt about his pure talent, which was truly extraordinary. Even so, he left behind a complicated legacy, a cautionary tale that underscores how crucial maturity, discipline, and good counsel are when it comes to success in pro sports. Anyone who watched him blaze through his rookie season can recall the highlights: that 5-goal outburst in just his third NHL game, his knack for finishing passes as if the net were twice as large, and the joy with which he'd celebrate a big goal in front of the roaring New York crowd. But equally, people recall the tabloid stories, the courtroom drama, and the one-year suspension from the league that used him as an example. For a young athlete, public shame of that magnitude is an unendurable weight that requires incredible resilience to overcome. Though he managed some fleeting triumphs later on, like a hat trick upon his return, or that short successful playoff push in Edmonton. He never fully recaptured the unstoppable brilliance that had once made him the hottest commodity in the NHL. In many ways, Murdoch's story was tied to the larger culture of 1970s hockey and to the environment in New York. The city was a neon-lit playground, and if you had money and a recognizable face, you could get away with nearly anything, until you couldn't. The disco clubs welcomed celebrities with open arms, blurring lines between what was acceptable and what was forbidden. For a kid from Cranbrook, the leap into that fast-paced world was disorienting. He was surrounded by people who wanted a piece of his stardom, and he was ill-equipped to separate true friends from enablers. The doping question in the NHL was hardly discussed openly at the time, so when Murdoch was caught, the league could claim ignorance about how widespread cocaine usage might be. In truth, many players dabbled in the same nightlife, but Murdoch was the first major star to stand in the glaring spotlight of a drug bust. His misfortune served as a pivotal turning point for how the NHL would publicly address substance abuse. Even though, in retrospect, the blanket punishment approach was seen as heavy-handed, it revealed that the league was as much concerned with optics and shielding its reputation as it was with genuine reform. Murdoch, singled out, bore the brunt of that wave of indignation, and it unquestionably damaged his career trajectory. The lifetime of regrets he carried centers around those fateful months and how differently he might have handled the fame, the partying, and the crowd he chose to surround himself with. Yet the story does not end purely in despair. Murdoch's transformation into a well-regarded scout and a dedicated hockey educator in his later years stands as a testament to his ability to grow. He channeled his storied experiences, from reaching the pinnacle of adoration at Madison Square Garden to languishing in relative anonymity in the minors, into valuable lessons for new prospects. Talk to people who crossed paths with him in the scouting world, and you'll hear about a man with a sharp eye for skill and a genuine desire to see young players succeed. He warned them about the temptations that lurk once you sign that big contract or when you're hailed as the next big thing in a major sports market. He knew better than anyone how quickly the bright lights could turn into a prison of rumor, tabloids, and addictive behavior. Sometimes, in hockey circles, you'll hear stories about the one that got away. Don Murdoch's name frequently surfaces in those discussions. Hardcore Rangers fans reminisce. Remember that 5-goal game at the start of his career? They'd talk about a moment in time when he was unstoppable, a dynamic sniper blessed with reflexes that seemed almost preternatural for a young rookie. Watching him in those early days, it was easy to believe the hype that he would annihilate rookie scoring records and cement himself among the truly elite. Instead, that promise wilted under the combined pressures of injuries, substance abuse, and the inability to cope with an endless stream of temptations in a city famous for them. All these years later, one might wonder how Murdoch's story would have played out in the modern NHL, with far greater awareness and assistance programs for players dealing with personal issues. Substance abuse protocols, mental health counseling, and more robust support systems might have shielded him from some of his worst decisions. Social media, ironically, would have either exposed him earlier or forced him to seek help sooner, given that it's much more difficult to keep illicit activities under wraps in an age of 24/7 surveillance. Still, these are speculations. The reality is, Murdoch came of age in a very different time, and he faced consequences that, in hindsight, were shaped by both league politics and societal attitudes around drugs. In interviews later in life, Murdoch consistently took responsibility for his choices. He noted that part of the problem was the breakneck speed of his stardom, leaving him unprepared for the swirl of influences that come with being a sports sensation in a massive media market. He acknowledged that a sense of invincibility might have crept into his psyche. After all, things had come so easily on the ice that it seemed he could do no wrong. The instant adoration from fans, the sense of being unstoppable in a city famous for anointing new heroes, all contributed to a bubble of self-indulgence. He was rarely, if ever, told no, and he never had time to develop the life skills to handle the adulation responsibly. For the Rangers, the roller coaster ride from championing him as the next big sniper to enduring the fallout of a drug scandal left a complicated imprint on the franchise's history. They had recognized a gem in Murdoch and got a fleeting glimpse of his brilliance, but the swirl of negative attention and the subsequent struggles overshadowed the bright start. Still, for that initial year, the staid corridors of Madison Square Garden buzzed with excitement every time he touched the puck. Veteran players marveled at how easily he found the back of the net, and the media salivated at the prospect of him shattering rookie records. It is often said that in sports, timing is everything. The team had parted ways with Rick Middleton, leaving a vacancy on the right wing that Murdoch seemed destined to fill with explosive success. But while Middleton blossomed in Boston, Murdoch would soon be fighting for his career, not just the next scoring milestone. Even within that tumultuous 1977-78 season, where the impending drug trial hung over his head, Murdoch still displayed an undeniable scoring flair. That alone is testament to just how massive his potential was. Imagine how many players would have crumbled entirely under the weight of those circumstances, yet he continued to be a legitimate threat in the Rangers lineup, albeit not at the superlative level of his rookie year. Phil Esposito's recollections emphasize that the coaching staff kept grasping for ways to channel Murdoch's talent, hoping that a turning point might come once the legal troubles were finally resolved. But once the guilty plea arrived and the league delivered its suspension, the script took a much darker turn. The year-long ban was devastating, especially for someone already battling an injury history and personal demons. Missing that significant chunk of development time, especially in one's early 20s, is no small matter. Hockey players thrive on consistent play, on feeling the rhythm of the season, and on constantly refining their skills. Stripped of competitive action, Murdoch was forced to occupy himself with practice sessions and personal workouts that lacked the intensity of real competition. That alone might have been enough to derail a budding star, but in his case, the psychological toll was equally significant. He was labeled and stigmatized, turning him into a cautionary example that overshadowed whatever triumphs he managed to achieve thereafter. When he eventually returned, with that memorable hat trick in his second game back, it felt like the redemption arc fans love to see in sports. For a while, that hopeful narrative held up, especially with the formation of the Mafia line, which gave Rangers fans renewed optimism that the team could make a deep postseason run. And indeed, they did reach the Stanley Cup final in 1979, surprising the hockey world by knocking off the heavily favored Islanders in the semifinals. Sadly, injuries and inconsistent play continued to plague Murdoch, and he never truly dominated in a sustained manner again. Within a year, his role was reduced, and he requested a trade, heading off to the emerging powerhouse in Edmonton. Teaming up with Wayne Gretzky is the stuff of dreams for a winger, and for a brief moment, it seemed that Murdoch might find new life next to the game's most gifted playmaker. But Jari Kurri, the unassuming Finn with brilliant hockey sense, changed that trajectory in short order. Once Murdoch was relegated away from Gretzky's line, speculation ignited that his off-ice reputation also haunted him. The fear that he might be a poor role model for a rapidly maturing Mark Messier did him no favors in the Oilers' front office. And when you're no longer producing at an elite clip on the ice, management has fewer reasons to look past those personal issues. The decision to expose him on waivers, and the league's collective shrug in response, signaled a sobering reality. Star power only goes so far when accompanied by heavy baggage. Wichita was then both a low point and a turning point. Struggling in the minors, losing motivation, missing practices. These were signs that perhaps Murdoch had already resigned himself to the notion that his career was spiraling downward. Yet that surprising playoff run, with his 17 goals in 18 games, proved he still had it in him to elevate his game under pressure. It was an encouraging sign for a handful of NHL teams still curious about the magnitude of his raw skills. Detroit took a cautious gamble, but the spark fizzled quickly, and Murdoch ended up in Adirondack. From there, the once promising start trickled through a handful of lesser leagues until, finally, he could see the writing on the wall and decided to retire before reaching 30. The subsequent revelations from Thin Ice only exacerbated the negative mystique around his name. Detailed stories of his raucous escapades, colorful though they were, painted a picture of a man who had skated perilously close to self-destruction. It's a reminder that even while playing in the All or CHL, he was haunted by the choices he had made during his flashiest days in New York. The constant rehashing of these incidents kept him in the public eye for all the wrong reasons, overshadowing the skill that had once dazzled the hockey world. Yet, as the years wore on, Murdoch found unexpected fulfillment in scouting and coaching. Perhaps it was the act of traveling to small-town rinks to watch teenage prospects that helped him remember the simpler love of the game. In scouting, he used the sharp sense of talent he always possessed, and in so doing, he earned respect within the hockey community not as a cautionary figure, but as someone who understood the pressures young players face. He was no saint, nor did he pretend to be. He simply recognized that what he had endured could serve as a lesson, and he was willing to share it. Watching his development into a father figure and mentor for hopeful prospects is one of the more uplifting transformations in a narrative that could have remained stuck in tragedy. Those who attended his hockey school in Cranbrook recall a man who was warm, approachable, and candid about his past. He was never shy about discussing the mistakes he made, perhaps hoping that by doing so, he might inoculate even a few teenagers from making the same errors. He was living proof that no amount of talent can protect you from the consequences of reckless choices. Those who saw him in the stands at youth hockey tournaments or in small-town rinks across Canada and the United States speak of a man ready to greet them with a smile, a story, or a pointer about their budding game. Time had tempered his rebellious streak, but not his love for hockey. He remained a people person at heart, someone who thrived on interactions, the very trait that had once led him astray amid New York's labyrinth of nightlife. Now, it served him in a more constructive way, letting him guide players, talk to parents about the realities of a hockey career, and shape the future of an NHL franchise through scouting reports. Despite everything, he is remembered with a kind of fondness by many of his former teammates. Some mention how unstoppable he was on the ice when he was focused. Others recall that, away from the more sordid aspects of his story, he had a hearty laugh and a genuine camaraderie. He and Phil Esposito, who was no stranger to the spotlight himself, maintained a friendship that might have baffled outsiders given the controversies, but it stood the test of time. Esposito understood the pitfalls of fame and recognized that Murdoch's downfall was a cautionary tale about being thrust too soon into life's extremes. All these elements, the meteoric start, the sudden injuries, the drug bust, the disciplinary action, the illusions of a comeback, the minor league exile, the redemption through scouting, the quiet retirement in Cranbrook, converge into a single narrative that is as tragic as it is enlightening. Fans of hockey lore often find themselves fascinated by these rise and fall stories, but few arcs illustrate the complexities more vividly than Murdoch's. His love for the game was sincere, his skill was undeniable, but his Achilles heel was the inability to cope with the temptations swirling around him, especially when the spotlights burned their brightest. To this day, you can meet older Rangers loyalists who speak of Murdoch in awe, recounting the night he netted 5 goals as a rookie, or the time he fired a laser beam of a snapshot into the top corner that seemed unstoppable. They'll lament the heartbreak of seeing such a gifted player unravel under off-ice pressures. And perhaps they'll end their recollection with a sigh or a shake of the head, reflecting on how ephemeral success can be when maturity and guidance are lacking. Younger fans might stumble on his story, wonder who this Don Murdoch was, and be amazed at how different the hockey world once was, less structured, less media scrutiny, but ironically just as punishing when controversies spilled into the limelight. For Murdoch himself, the real triumph might be found not in a stat sheet or in rewriting the record books, but in how he ultimately used his story to help others. He never fully got rid of the regret, how could he? But he could pay it forward, turning caution into cautionary tales for any player willing to listen. By the early 2000s, when he finally decided to step away from active roles in pro hockey, he did so with a reputation restored in many circles, his name no longer solely a punchline about drug scandals. People who interacted with him in the scouting realm describe a man who had reconciled the ghosts of his past, determined to remain an ally to the sport he once nearly lost. When asked about his greatest regret, Murdoch often pointed to the single idea that he had been too young, too soon, for such a swirl of attention, free-flowing drinks, and endless parties. He understood, with a certain air of sadness, that some of those who had courted him were not true friends, merely thrill-seekers along for the ride. However, if he could do it over, he would still love to be a New York Ranger, just maybe with a mentor at his side, someone to teach him how to navigate the city's traps. It was a lesson he paid forward in his guidance of younger players, hoping they would reach for his phone number instead of an after-party invitation if they ever felt overwhelmed. For anyone looking back on his career highlights, it's worth remembering that at his best, Don Murdoch was a scoring machine who moved with effortless confidence across the rink, mesmerizing fans and opponents alike. That legacy never truly fades, even if overshadowed by the sensational headlines that defined his darkest days. Now, all these years on, many who meet him see not the fallen star, but rather an approachable figure with stories to tell and wisdom to impart. Despite everything, he remains someone who helps us understand that in sports, as in life, brilliance must be tempered by discipline, and the mightiest talents can be undone by their own reckless decisions. It's that richer, more complex narrative that makes him a figure worth remembering. Hockey fans love to debate what-if scenarios, and Don Murdoch's is among the most compelling. If you enjoyed this story or ever find yourself marveling at the raw talent of a rookie scoring at will, take a moment to recall the cautionary tale of the 1976-77 Rangers rookie Phenom. Remember that behind every highlight reel there is a human being facing personal struggles, and remember that no amount of stardom guarantees a picture-perfect journey. Indeed, Don Murdoch lived the thrill and the downfall, a spectacular rise followed by a humiliating fall, from which he emerged as a wiser and more grounded man, a testament to the unpredictability of both hockey and life. Thanks for watching.